I still see my son, Leo, at the head of our dining table, laughing over a story I'd told 100 times. Today. That table is a landscape of grief, but not all sorrow is genuine. My daughter-in-law, Isabella, sits in his shadow, her eyes dry, her posture a little too perfect. I see the subtle glances at her phone, the flicker of impatience behind her carefully constructed mask of a grieving widow. It's a chilling thing to realize the person who should be your family sees you not as a mother, but as an obstacle, an inconvenient piece of an estate to be managed and, eventually, removed. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too, like and subscribe. My name is Evelyn, and at 70 years old, I believed I had a firm understanding of grief's architecture. I had navigated its empty rooms after my husband passed, learned the echo of my own footsteps in the silence he left behind. But nothing prepares you for the midnight call, the one that arrives when the world is asleep and defenses are down. It came at 2:17 a.m., a shrill tear in the fabric of the night. The phone on my nightstand, usually a silent sentinel, became an instrument of dread. On the third ring, my trembling hand answered, and a clinical, disembodied voice informed me that my only son, Leo, had been admitted to Port Blossom General, a suspected brain aneurysm. The words were sterile, efficient, and they detonated my world. The drive to the hospital was a blur of streetlights bleeding into one another, my nightgown still beneath my coat. I was a professor of psychology for 35 years, a student of human behavior. Yet in that moment, I was simply a mother, stripped of all analysis, running on the raw fuel of fear. The hospital was a sterile maze of fluorescent lights and the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic that fails to cover the underlying odor of human suffering. A grim-faced doctor, his eyes etched with a weariness that spoke of too many nights like this, led me to a small, windowless room. The words he used were gentle, professional, but they were hammers against the fragile glass of my hope. Massive. No warning signs. Nothing could have been done. And then, the final blow. He's already gone. Time ceased to function in any linear way. Hours bled together in a fog of paperwork and decisions no parent should ever have to make. As I sat in the sterile quiet, a single cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside me, my mind replayed a decade of my son's marriage. I'd always found Isabella's ambition admirable, her polish impressive. But there was a transactional quality to their relationship I could never quite ignore. Leo, my generous, open-hearted son, often seemed to be the one making all the concessions, smoothing over her social slights, funding a lifestyle that grew more lavish with each passing year. I had dismissed my concerns as the typical anxieties of a mother. But now, in this harsh, fluorescent light, those small moments of unease felt like prescient warnings I had failed to heed. It was nearly noon when my daughter-in-law, Isabella, finally arrived. She swept into the quiet waiting area not with the frantic haste of a worried wife, but with the composed air of someone attending a business meeting they were slightly late for. Designer sunglasses hid her eyes, and her expensively manicured nails tapped an impatient rhythm on the screen of her phone. The traffic was just awful, she offered, her gaze sweeping the room before briefly landing on me. There was no hug, no shared collapse into sorrow. I had already called our grandson Noah's school, arranging for him to stay with a friend, a task that hadn't seemed to cross her mind. Leo is gone, I said, my voice flat, watching her for a reaction, for any crack in the polished veneer. Her perfectly lipsticked mouth formed a small O of surprise, a hand fluttering to her throat in a gesture that felt rehearsed, a scene from a movie she had once watched. For a fleeting moment, I saw something genuine flash in her eyes, not grief, but a rapid, cold calculation. It was the look of a chess player reassessing the board after an unexpected move. Then, just as quickly, the facade of the devastated widow slipped back into place. I had spent a decade observing Isabella's carefully curated persona at family gatherings, but this was her masterpiece. As she began making hushed, urgent calls, stepping away whenever a nurse approached, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with my own sorrow. I overheard a snippet of conversation, something about rescheduling the appraisal and unavoidable family matter, before her voice dropped to an indecipherable whisper. My son was gone, and the woman he had loved was already moving pieces on a new board, one where he was no longer a player, the first seed of a terrible. Cold suspicion had been planted in the barren ground of my heart. The days that followed were a suffocating blur of arrangements, each task a fresh wave of an agony I thought unsurvivable. I offered to stay at their house to be with Noah, to shield him with some semblance of familiarity, but Isabella politely declined. It's best if we maintain his routine, she'd said, a statement that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt like a gate being closed. I called every day, and my conversations with Noah were brief, his voice small and distant. He mentioned that Mommy was on the phone a lot, in her office with the door closed. One afternoon, I drove by the house under the pretext of dropping off a casserole, only to see a sleek, unfamiliar black sedan parked a block away the same model Julian Croft drove. It was gone minutes later, a ghost in the periphery, leaving me to wonder if my grief was making me paranoid, or if I was the only one seeing the truth. The funeral was held on a gray, drizzly Oregon afternoon, the sky weeping the tears I could no longer shed. From my seat in the front pew, I had a clear view of the procession of mourners, and an even clearer view of my daughter-in-law's portrayal of sorrow. Isabella had dressed for the part impeccably, in a black dress that was both somber and exquisitely tailored. Her grief was an accessory, worn with the same deliberate elegance as her pearl earrings. She leaned against me at calculated intervals, her touch light and fleeting, murmuring platitudes for the benefit of onlookers. To the world, we were the heartbroken mother and the devastated widow, united in loss. But I could feel the tension in her frame, the way she would subtly straighten whenever someone of importance approached, her voice shifting in tone and warmth depending on the mourner's perceived social standing. An elderly woman, a pro bono client Leo had helped save from foreclosure, clutched my hand with genuine tears, and Isabella offered her a brief, dismissive nod before turning her full, radiant sorrow upon a wealthy city councilman. My primary focus, however, was on my grandson, Noah, a small, fragile figure seated on my other side. His grief was not a performance, it was a raw, visceral thing, shaking his small body in silent, hiccuping sobs. I kept my arm wrapped around him, a human anchor in his storm of confusion and pain. Unlike his mother, his face was blotchy and swollen from real tears. When he reached for Isabella's hand, she patted his distractedly, her eyes already scanning the crowd over his head. He was the living, breathing embodiment of Leo's love. And in that moment, my purpose began to shift from simply surviving my son's death to protecting his legacy. It was during the reception that my vague suspicions began to sharpen into concrete fear. I noticed Isabella in a hushed, intense conversation with a tall, impeccably dressed man that I recognized as Julian Croft, one of Leo's real estate investment partners. They stood in a secluded alcove, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that suggested an intimacy far beyond business. It wasn't just a conversation, it was a conspiracy of whispers and shared glances that lasted a fraction of a second too long. As I approached, they separated smoothly, but not before I saw Isabella's hand briefly, possessively, touch his arm. It was a gesture of ownership, not of comfort. Later, as the last of the mourners departed, Leo's closest friend and personal attorney, Arthur Vance, approached me. His own eyes were reddened, his sorrow genuine and profound. He pulled me aside, away from the lingering guests and the watchful eyes of Isabella. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Leo made me promise to tell you something. Immediately after this," he hesitated, glancing towards Isabella, who was now directing the catering staff with crisp efficiency. He was deeply concerned. For months, he had an appointment scheduled with me for this past Thursday, an urgent one. He told me he needed to restructure his entire estate plan, that he believed he'd made a terrible mistake years ago. Arthur took a deep breath, and his next words landed with chilling weight. He didn't give me the details, but he was worried about Noah's future. His last instruction to me was this: tell my mother to trust her instincts about Noah, no matter what. Tell her to trust her gut. The message, delivered in the somber quiet of the funeral home, felt like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. It was a warning, a directive from beyond the grave. It confirmed that the cold unease I felt wasn't just a byproduct of grief, it was a validation. My son had seen something, had known something was wrong, and his final act was to arm me not with facts or figures, but with permission to believe what my heart was already telling me, that this was not just a tragedy, but the beginning of a battle for his son's future. The day after the funeral, Arthur called to schedule the reading of the will. Isabella had initially pushed for it to be handled immediately, a request that seemed jarringly pragmatic. But she agreed to the following Tuesday. We met in Arthur's office, a space that felt both familiar and alien. It was filled with the scent of old books and leather, a place where I had celebrated with Leo when he first made partner. And now it was the stage for the first act of this grim, unfolding drama. I sat in a plush leather chair, my hands folded in my lap, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing a scene from a play. Isabella sat opposite me, the picture of subdued elegance, her black attire a stark contrast to the vibrant, sunlit city visible through the large window behind her. She offered me a small, sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. Arthur, his face etched with a sorrow that was both personal and professional, began to read. The legal language was dense, but the core of it was brutally simple. Leo had been methodical. There were bequests to charities, provisions for his funeral expenses to be paid from his estate, and then came the main assets. Arthur cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the document. To my wife, Isabella Croft Reynolds, I bequeath our lake house property on Silver Lake and the full contents of the life insurance policy held with Pacific Mutual. I watched Isabella's face. There was a flicker of smug satisfaction, the look of someone whose expectations were being met. She likely knew the value of the insurance policy, a substantial seven-figure sum. But then Arthur continued, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. All remaining real estate, including the primary family residence at 1742 Ocean View Drive. Arthur read, his voice steady. Along with both vehicles, a Mercedes sedan and a Range Rover SUV, and the entirety of my personal savings and checking accounts held at Port Blossom National Bank, are bequeathed to my beloved mother, Evelyn Reynolds. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Isabella's carefully composed expression froze. For a full 10 seconds, she didn't move, her mind clearly racing to process the words she had just heard. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a stark, unfiltered disbelief that quickly hardened into something else. I saw the muscles in her jaw tighten, her perfectly manicured nails pressing into the leather arms of her chair. That's impossible, she said, her voice a low, controlled tremor. That house is our marital home. We chose it together. Her eyes darted to me, searching, accusing. Arthur, ever the professional, slid a sheaf of documents across the polished mahogany desk without looking up. The house was purchased solely in Leo's name prior to your marriage. Isabella. The deed was never converted to joint property. It's all legally indisputable. I kept my own expression a careful blank, a mask of shared surprise. Though a storm of understanding was breaking inside me, Leo had done this. He had built a financial fortress around me and Noah, and he had done it in secret. And Noah's college fund, Isabella demanded, her voice rising slightly, the first crack in her composure. Leo always promised he was setting aside a significant fund for Noah's education. Arthur nodded. Leo established an irrevocable trust for Noah's educational and care expenses. It is very generously funded. A flicker of relief crossed Isabella's face, but it was short-lived. However, Arthur added, you are not the trustee. Isabella's head snapped toward him. Then who is? The question was a hiss of venom wrapped in silk. Arthur finally lifted his gaze and looked at me. Evelyn has been named the sole trustee. The carefully constructed persona shattered. For a moment, I saw the real Isabella furious, cornered, and utterly transparent in her greed. She quickly reined it in, her expression softening into one of wounded confusion. A masterful pivot back to her role as the victim. Evelyn, she said, her voice now laced with a practiced, pleading tone. This is clearly a mistake. Leo was under so much stress lately. He wasn't thinking clearly. You know he would want his son to grow up in his own home. You have your own house. Surely you wouldn't. She left the threat hanging in the air. The unspoken implication that I would be the villain if I enforced my own son's final wishes. I simply looked at her and said, truthfully, I am as shocked as you are. Isabella, I need time to process this. After she left, her departure marked by a stiff posture and a curt nod. Arthur asked me to stay. He closed the heavy office door, and the silence felt different now, imbued with a shared secret. There's more, Evelyn, he said quietly, his professional demeanor softening. Leo left this for you. He was very specific that you were to receive it privately. After the will was read, he retrieved a small, unassuming object from his desk drawer, a silver USB drive. No bigger than my thumb. It felt impossibly heavy in my palm. My name was etched onto it in my son's familiar, slightly slanted handwriting. I drove home in a daze, the little silver drive a cold, hard presence in my purse. The house felt cavernous and empty, the silence pressing in on me. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink and sat at Leo's old desk in the study, the USB drive on the blotter in front of me. For a long time, I just looked at it, my heart a painful knot in my chest. This was it. This was the explanation. The missing piece Leo had left for me. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I plugged it into my laptop. A single password-protected folder appeared on the screen. My mind went blank. What could it be then? A memory surfaced, warm and bittersweet. Leo. As a little boy, obsessed with astronomy, pointing to a picture book about space. He would trace the constellations with his small finger and whisper the same phrase every night before bed. A secret promise between us. My fingers, clumsy with emotion, typed the words, "The stars are waiting." The folder opened. Inside were 3 items. The first was a subfolder labeled Correspondence. Clicking on it revealed dozens of screenshots of text messages. They were between Isabella and Julian Croft. Stretching back nearly a year, I began to read, and the world tilted on its axis for the second time in a week. The messages were a brutal, damning chronicle of betrayal. They spoke of clandestine meetings, of expensive gifts, of a shared contempt for my son, whom they referred to with cruel nicknames. They detailed a plan, a cold and calculated strategy to wait until a major real estate deal of Leo's closed, and then for Isabella to file for divorce, arguing for half of the assets. One message from Isabella burned itself into my memory. Just a few more months of playing the dutiful wife, then we can finally be free, and I'll have what I've earned. The second file was a spreadsheet, a meticulous record of financial transactions. Leo, the careful lawyer, had documented everything. Credit card statements filled with lavish purchases I knew he hadn't been aware of. Cash withdrawals from their joint account that corresponded with dates of the text messages. And evidence that Isabella had been slowly moving funds into a private account under her maiden name. It was a portrait of systematic theft, hidden behind the facade of a perfect marriage. But it was the last file, a simple document titled For Mom. That broke me completely. I clicked it open, and my son's words filled the screen. It was a letter, raw and full of a pain I could feel through the cold pixels. He wrote of his accidental discovery of the messages, of the soul-crushing realization that his marriage was a lie. He wrote not of anger, but of a profound sadness and a desperate, all-consuming fear for his son. "I look at Noah," he had written, "and I see her ambition, her calculation, but I also see my own heart. I'm terrified she will mold him into a tool for her own purposes. Or worse, discard him when he is no longer useful. She doesn't love him. Mom, she loves the idea of him, the perfect accessory to her perfect life." The letter went on to lay out his plan, the same one the will had revealed: the house, the money, the trust. They weren't gifts for me, but tools for me to use. "This is your fortress," he wrote. "From here, you can protect him. She will fight you. She will manipulate you. She will try to turn everyone, even Noah, against you. Do not confront her. Do not let her know what you know. Watch, wait, and document everything. Arthur has the rest. You are the only one I trust to see this through." He ended the letter with a simple, devastating line: "I'm sorry I couldn't fix this. I love you." I pressed my hands to my mouth to stifle a sob, fresh tears spilling down my cheeks, hot and cleansing. The grief was still there, a vast, dark ocean. But now, something else was rising from its depths: a cold, hard certainty, a purpose. My son, even as he faced his own mortality, had been planning for this war. He had laid the groundwork, provided the weapons, and given me my orders. My mission was no longer a vague instinct, it was a sacred trust, sealed with my son's final words. And for Leo, and for Noah, I would become everything Isabella never expected. I would be patient, I would be observant, and I would be unbreakable. Isabella did not wait long to make her first move. 3 days after the will reading, she appeared at my doorstep, a box of expensive pastries in one hand and a carefully rehearsed expression of concern on her face. It was a classic psychological maneuver. Arrive with a gift to create an immediate, albeit minor, sense of obligation. I invited her in, playing the part of the slightly frail, grief-stricken mother-in-law, a role I knew she expected and needed me to inhabit. I moved slowly, my shoulders slumped, offering her tea in a voice I kept deliberately soft and unsteady. She settled onto my sofa, placing the pastries on the coffee table between us like a peace offering. "Evelyn," she began, her tone a perfect blend of sympathy and gentle reason, "I've been so worried about you, and about this whole situation." She gestured vaguely, as if the will were a minor misunderstanding between friends. "I've been thinking constantly about what's best for Noah. This house," she said, looking around the living room of what was now legally my property. "It's filled with so many memories of Leo. Every corner must be a painful reminder for him. For both of us." Her words were wrapped in the velvet glove of compassion, but the iron fist of her intention was unmistakable. She was framing the house not as an asset, but as a source of trauma, a place that needed to be shed for the sake of healing. I nodded slowly, letting my eyes fill with manufactured tears. "It is difficult," I whispered, allowing my voice to crack. This was the vulnerability she needed to see, the confirmation that I was an emotional creature, not a strategic one. "Exactly," she pressed on, leaning forward with an air of confidentiality. "A fresh start is what he needs, what we both need. And frankly, Evelyn, the legalities of this are just so messy. Lawyers, paperwork, it's the last thing we should be dealing with right now. It creates conflict. And that's the opposite of what Noah needs." She was building her case brick by brick, each one mortared with my grandson's name. He was not the subject of her concern. He was the shield for her ambition. "I've spoken with an attorney," she continued, a casual mention designed to both intimidate and reassure. "And he said we can simplify everything. If you were to sign the house over to me, we could avoid all the unpleasantness. It would be a clean, simple transfer. It's what Leo would have wanted, for his family to remain in their home, to have that stability." There it was, the ultimate manipulation, invoking the wishes of the dead man whose true intentions she was actively trying to subvert. My son's letter burned in my memory. "She will fight you. She will manipulate you. I took a shaky breath, looking at her with wide, sorrowful eyes. Oh, Isabella, I said, my voice trembling. It's all so overwhelming. I don't know what to think. You're right. Of course. Noah is the only thing that matters. Let me let me just have a few days to process everything. My mind is such a fog. Relief washed over her features, so clear and unguarded that it was almost comical. She had her hook in. She believed I was weak, malleable, and lost in my grief. She patted my hand with a condescending warmth. Of course, Evelyn. Take all the time you need. Just know that I'm only thinking of what's best for our family. After she left, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air like a toxic cloud, I walked directly to my study. I took out a new leather-bound journal and a fountain pen. On the first page, I wrote the date, the time, and a verbatim account of our conversation. I detailed her words, her tone, the subtle shifts in her expression. I noted the gift of pastries, a classic tool of influence. Duh. This was not just a diary of my grief, it was the first entry in a catalog of war. Leo's instructions were clear: watch, wait, and document everything. The game had begun, and she had just revealed her opening strategy. In the weeks that followed, I settled into my role as the passive, grieving observer. While Isabella began her campaign in earnest, my primary source of intelligence was Noah, who now spent every other weekend with me. An arrangement Isabella encouraged, likely believing it kept me placated. But children are terrible keepers of sophisticated secrets. They are. However, excellent conduits of the emotional truths around them. Noah began to arrive at my house with a new kind of anxiety clinging to him. He was quieter, more watchful, and would sometimes repeat things with a confused frown that were clearly not his own thoughts. Mommy says this house is too old for you to take care of by yourself. Grandma, he mentioned one afternoon as we worked on a puzzle, she says you must be very lonely here. I simply smiled and squeezed his shoulder. I'm never lonely when you're here, sweetheart. Then came an unexpected call from Noah's third-grade teacher, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable. She sounded hesitant, careful not to overstep. Evelyn, she said, I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to check in. Noah's been distracted lately. He forgot his homework twice this week, which is very unlike him. And today, he didn't have a lunch. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Isabella didn't pack him a lunch, I asked, keeping my voice even. He said his mother had an early meeting and forgot. Mrs. Gable explained. Of course, we gave him something from the cafeteria, but I was just concerned. He seems to have a lot on his mind. I thanked her for her concern, my mind racing. This wasn't just grief. This was neglect. Small at first, but a clear pattern was emerging. I documented the call meticulously in my journal, another piece of the mosaic I was building. The whispers grew more targeted. One evening, while tucking him into bed, he looked at me with wide, serious eyes. Is Belize nice? He asked. The question was so out of left field that it took me a moment to respond. I imagine it's very beautiful, I said carefully. Why do you ask? He shrugged, pulling his blanket up to his chin. Mommy was showing me pictures on her computer of a big white house right on the beach. She said we could go live there and Julian would buy me a boat. She said there are no sad memories in Belize. The casual cruelty of it, erasing his father's memory and replacing it with the promise of a shiny, new life with her lover, made my blood run cold. She wasn't just trying to take a house. She was trying to steal my grandson's past. Julian's direct involvement began a week later. He arrived with Isabella to pick up Noah. Stepping out of his sleek black sedan with an overly familiar smile plastered on his face, he was handsome in a predatory way, all sharp angles and expensive tailoring. Evelyn, he said, extending a hand that I took reluctantly. I've heard so much about you. I'm so sorry for your loss. His condolences were as hollow as a drum. Then he turned his attention to Noah, crouching down to his level. Hey there, champ. I brought you something. From the back of his car, he produced a brand new, top of the line gaming console, the kind Noah had only dreamed of. Noah's eyes widened with a child's pure, unadulterated joy. But as Julian presented the gift, his demeanor shifted. He ruffled Noah's hair a little too roughly, his questions coming a little too fast. You're going to love it. We'll have to play online when you and your mom come visit me, right? Maybe we can even get you a professional gaming chair for your new room in Belize. He was not giving a gift. He was making a down payment. I watched Noah's initial excitement curdle into discomfort. He clutched the box to his chest but took a small step back. Closer to me? Julian didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he didn't care. His focus was on closing the deal, on securing the boy as part of the package. As they were leaving, Isabella paused at the door. Oh, Evelyn, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. I do hope you're taking your blood pressure medication, managing all this stress. At your age, it can be a lot. We just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself. And it was a subtle, venomous dart, aimed at planting a seed of doubt about my competence, my fitness. It was a threat disguised as care, and I logged it in my journal the moment the door closed. Later that night, long after the lights were out, Noah crept into my room. He was clutching his old, worn teddy bear. The one Leo had won for him at a county fair years ago. The new gaming console sat untouched in its box. Grandma, he whispered in the dark. I don't like him. I didn't have to ask who he meant. He talks too loud, Noah continued, his voice trembling slightly. And his hands feel slimy. He smells like the stuff Mommy drinks at night. I don't want to go to Belize. I want to stay here, in Dad's house. He finally broke down. The silent, brave tears he'd been holding back giving way to deep, shuddering sobs that seemed to tear through his small frame. I held him close, rocking him gently, my own heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and white-hot fury. This was the proof Leo had feared. This was the emotional damage he had tried to prevent. As I held my grandson, I made a silent promise to my son. I would not let them do this. I would not let them poison his heart or erase his memory. I would use the fortress he had built for us, and I would defend it to the last. The morning after Noah's confession, my resolve had hardened from a simmering ember into a cold, sharp point of steel. The time for passive observation was over. It was time to act. I called Arthur before the sun had fully risen over the Pacific, my voice steady and devoid of the tremor that had plagued it for weeks. I recounted everything Isabella's manipulations, the whispers of Belize, Julian's predatory gift-giving, the call from Noah's teacher, and finally, Noah's terrified, tearful plea in the dark. Arthur listened in silence, the only sound on his end the faint scratching of a pen. When I finished, he let out a long, slow breath. This is it. Evelyn, he said, his voice grim. This is the pattern of emotional neglect and potential flight risk we needed. We have grounds to file for an emergency temporary custody order. The decision, though monumental, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. It was the next logical step on the path Leo had laid out for me. We spent the next 2 days compiling my journal entries, the screenshots from the USB drive, and a sworn affidavit from me into a formidable legal petition. Arthur's team worked with a quiet, focused intensity that was both reassuring and terrifying. This was real. We were no longer in the realm of suspicion and quiet documentation. We were stepping onto the battlefield. Arthur warned me of the coming storm. They will fight back, Evelyn, and it will be ugly. Julian has deep pockets. He'll hire the best, most ruthless attorneys in the state. They will try to paint you as a meddling, vindictive old woman trying to steal her grandchild. I steeled myself. Let them try, I said. I have the truth. The petition was filed on a Wednesday. The emergency hearing was set for Friday. The speed was dizzying. That Friday morning, I found myself in a cold, imposing courtroom that felt a world away from the warm, loving home I was fighting for. Isabella was already there, seated beside a sharp, silver-haired attorney who radiated an aura of excessive, reptilian confidence. She was the very picture of a wronged mother. Her face a mask of pale, tragic beauty, a single, artful tear tracing a path down her cheek. Julian sat in the gallery directly behind her, a silent, powerful presence, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. It was a perfectly staged tableau of victimhood and support. Arthur presented our case with calm, methodical precision, laying out the evidence of Isabella's emotional detachment, her focus on financial matters, her plans to uproot Noah, and the clear distress it was causing the child. Then, her attorney, Mr. Davies, rose to speak. He was a master of insinuation and rhetorical poison. He portrayed Isabella as a modern mother, wisely delegating childcare while she bravely navigated her grief. Then, he turned his attention to me, and the attack became deeply personal. Your Honor, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. We must also consider the source of these accusations. Mrs. Reynolds is not merely a grandmother. She is a retired professor of psychology. For 35 years. Her profession was the clinical analysis and, one might argue, the manipulation of human behavior. He gestured toward my journal, which Arthur had submitted as evidence, say. This is not a diary of a concerned grandparent. This is a manufactured case study, a clinical file built with a singular, biased objective to pathologize a grieving mother and alienate her from her own son. She is using her professional training to wage a psychological war against her daughter-in-law. The accusation hung in the air, venomous and shockingly effective. He had taken my greatest strength, my understanding of the human mind, and twisted it into a weapon against me. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Carlton, listened impassively, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes' consideration. My heart hammered against my ribs. When she finally spoke, her words were a crushing blow. While the petitioner's concerns are noted, she said, her voice devoid of emotion, the evidence presented does not meet the high bar required for an emergency removal of a child from their biological mother. The request for temporary custody is denied. A wave of nausea washed over me. Across the room, I saw a triumphant smirk flash across Julian's face before it was replaced by a somber nod. Isabella let out a delicate, theatrical sob of relief. But the judge wasn't finished. However, she continued, her sharp gaze pinning Isabella to her seat, Mr. Davies's characterization of the petitioner is troubling, and the court does find sufficient cause for concern regarding the child's emotional well-being. Therefore, I am ordering a comprehensive psychological evaluation of the family, to be conducted by a court-appointed child psychologist. All parties will cooperate fully. A follow-up hearing will be scheduled upon receipt of the evaluator's report. It was not the victory we had hoped for, but it was not a total defeat. It was a lifeline. As we left the courtroom, Isabella, emboldened by her perceived win, approached me. I hope you're satisfied. Evelyn, she said, her voice low and laced with venom. You've dragged your grandson through a court battle for nothing. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a life to plan. And the setback was a bitter pill to swallow. But as I watched her walk away, her arm linked possessively with Julian's, I knew this was just the first round. The real fight, the one for the truth of what was happening in Noah's heart, was just beginning. The court-appointed evaluator was a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, whose calm demeanor and intelligent eyes immediately put me at ease. The evaluations were to take place over several weeks, with individual sessions for me, Isabella, and Noah. My sessions were straightforward. I presented my concerns, backed by my journal, focusing always on Noah's behavior and well being. I knew Isabella's sessions would be a masterclass in manipulation. The true battle would be fought in the quiet, safe space Dr. Sharma created for my grandson. A week into the evaluations, Dr. Sharma scheduled an unannounced home visit with Isabella. I learned later from Arthur what had transpired. Isabella and Julian had staged a perfect scene of domestic bliss. When Dr. Sharma arrived, the air was filled with the scent of freshly baked cookies. Isabella, wearing a soft cashmere sweater, was helping Noah frost them at the kitchen island, while Julian sat at the dining table, patiently helping him assemble a complex model airplane. It was a picture of a warm, blended family, healing together. Dr. Sharma observed, making pleasant conversation. As the visit was concluding, she asked a casual, final question. It's so lovely to see you all enjoying the house. What are your plans for the summer, Noah? Any fun camps? Noah, his face still smudged with chocolate frosting, looked up with the unfiltered honesty of a child. We're not going to be here for the summer, he said brightly. Mommy says after we finish with the talking doctor, we're moving to Belize. That's where Julian's new boat is. The silence that followed was, as Arthur later described it, deafening. The carefully constructed facade of a family committed to healing in their home shattered in an instant, undone by a child's innocent truth. Dr. Sharma simply nodded, her professional expression unreadable, and thanked them for their time. The mask had slipped, and for the first time, a neutral, expert witness had seen the truth beneath. The turning point, however, came not from a psychologist's office, but from Noah himself. One Sunday evening, as I was preparing to drive him back to Isabella's, he came to me with his tablet, his face pale and his hands trembling. Grandma, he whispered, you have to listen to this. He had been in his room, supposedly finishing his homework, when he overheard a loud, angry argument between Isabella and Julian. Their voices had carried from the downstairs living room. Frightened, he had hidden in his closet, and with a child's instinct to capture something he knew was wrong, he had turned on his tablet's voice recorder. He pressed play. The audio was slightly muffled, but their voices were clear, sharp with anger. Julian was complaining about the mounting legal fees. This is costing a fortune. Izzy, this evaluation is just another delay. Isabella's voice was shrill, defensive. What was I supposed to do? She ambushed me. We just have to play the game until we get the report. Then we're gone. Then came the words that stopped my heart. I can't deal with his moping anymore. Julian snapped. He's a constant reminder, a complication. There was a pause, and then Isabella's voice, stripped of all its practiced sweetness, cut through the air, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. He's a burden. Julian, don't you think I know that? He's a sad little burden I have to manage right now to get what we are owed. Once we're in Belize, things will be different. I listened, my hand flying to my mouth. A silent scream trapped in my throat. A burden. My son's child, my beautiful, grieving grandson, was nothing more than a burden to her, a temporary inconvenience on the path to her new life. Noah looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a terrible, adult understanding. He had not just recorded an argument, he had captured the unvarnished truth. The voice of a child, armed with a simple piece of technology, had just handed me the weapon I needed to end this war. The recording was a nuclear bomb, and the silence in Arthur's office the next morning was the eerie calm before the blast. He listened to the audio once, his face a grim mask, then played it again, closing his eyes as if to absorb the full, toxic weight of Isabella's words. There was no longer any ambiguity, no room for interpretation. This was the unvarnished truth. captured by the very child they were plotting to use and discard. This is it, Arthur said, his voice a low rumble of controlled fury. This is the end of the game. He immediately filed the recording with the court under seal and submitted an emergency motion to expedite the final custody hearing. Citing evidence of severe emotional endangerment, the court, which had previously moved with glacial slowness, responded with lightning speed. A final hearing was scheduled in less than a week. The news must have reached Isabella's legal team with the force of a physical blow, because that evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was Isabella. Her voice was different. The polished, confident cadence was gone, replaced by a tight, brittle edge of panic she couldn't fully conceal. "We need to talk." "Evelyn," she said, the words clipped and sharp. "No lawyers, just you and me. Tomorrow morning. The Rose Petal Cafe." It wasn't a request, it was a summons born of desperation. Arthur was vehemently against it. "It's a trap. Evelyn, she'll try to twist your words, record you, anything." But I knew I had to go. This wasn't about legal strategy anymore. This was about looking into the eyes of the woman who had so thoroughly broken my son's heart and was now trying to break his child's spirit. I needed to see the final act of her performance up close. I found her in a secluded booth at the back of the cafe, a place designed for secrets. She wore oversized sunglasses, but they couldn't hide the dark circles beneath her eyes or the faint tremor in the hand that held her coffee cup. The mask of the grieving widow was gone, replaced by the haggard look of a cornered animal, before she could launch into her demands. I decided to try one last time to find a flicker of the woman Leo must have once seen. "I was thinking about the park by the river," I began, my voice soft. "The day Leo taught Noah how to ride his bike without the training wheels. Do you remember how his face lit up? Isabella, he was so proud. He looked like he could have lit up the whole city with his smile. For a single, unguarded moment, something flickered across her face and a shadow of a memory. Perhaps, quickly extinguished. Her expression hardened. "I don't have time for sentimental nonsense." "Evelyn," she snapped, her voice brittle. "Why did you agree to meet me?" The door to her humanity, if it had ever been open, was now firmly shut and bolted. I let the silence stretch between us, my own demeanor shifting from soft to solid, letting her see the adversary who had been there all along. "I want my grandson to be safe." "Isabella," I said, my voice cold and clear as ice comes, "I want him to be loved, genuinely and without condition. That's all I have ever wanted." A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Don't you dare play the saint with me. You've been plotting this since the funeral." I didn't rise to the bait. I simply held her gaze until she looked away, her bravado crumbling. Finally, the true purpose of our meeting spilled out, a torrent of panicked self-preservation. "I'll give him to you," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'll sign over full, sole custody, no more court, no more psychologists, no more fighting. He's yours. You win." The offer was as monstrous as it was predictable. She was jettisoning her own child like excess baggage from a sinking ship. "And in return," I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "You make this go away," she said, leaning forward, her eyes glinting with a desperate cunning. "You destroy that recording. You sign a non-disclosure agreement and a document stating you will pursue no further financial claims against me or Leo's estate. You let me and Julian leave this city, and you never, ever contact us again. It's a clean break. Evelyn, everyone gets what they want." She actually believed it. She believed that abandoning her son was a neat and tidy solution, a business transaction where all parties could walk away satisfied. She was sacrificing her queen, as she saw it, to save her king from the board. I looked at this woman, this hollowed-out shell of ambition and greed, and felt a profound, desolate pity. I will have Arthur contact your lawyer with the terms, I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. I rose from the table without another word, leaving her alone with her coffee and the ruins of her life. The devil had offered her bargain, and for Noah's sake, I had just called her bluff. I recounted the entire conversation to Arthur, whose initial fury at her audacity quickly gave way to a cold, strategic focus. She's terrified. Evelyn, that recording is a character assassination she can't survive in court, but her offer is too clean, too sudden. She's not just running from this, she's running to something. We need to know what. Ugh. His advice was simple. We would agree in principle to her offer, but we would delay. We would bury her lawyers in paperwork, questioning every clause, proposing endless revisions to the custody agreement. We would create a legal quagmire, a bureaucratic swamp designed to do one thing: buy us time for the next week. That's exactly what we did. It was a frustrating, slow motion dance of emails and phone calls, a war fought with whereas and heretofore. Isabella's impatience grew with each passing day, her lawyer's messages becoming increasingly frantic. It was clear she was operating on a deadline, but we didn't yet know why. The answer arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, not in a legal document, but in the form of a nervous young woman who appeared at Arthur's office looking like a frightened bird. Her name was Clara, and she introduced herself as Julian Croft's now former personal assistant. She had been fired the day before, abruptly and without cause, offered a substantial severance package on the condition that she sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. She had refused. I can't, she said, her hands trembling around the cup of tea Arthur had given her. Not after what I know. Mr. Reynolds, Leo, he was always so kind to me. He didn't deserve what happened. She opened a large portfolio she had been clutching to her chest and laid its contents on Arthur's desk. It was a treasure trove of betrayal. Bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, incorporation documents for a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, and printouts of encrypted emails. Clara, with her unrestricted access to Julian's entire digital life, had copied everything. The paper trail was meticulous, damning, and it painted a picture of a breathtakingly ruthless con for months. Julian Croft had been systematically draining every asset he could touch his own, his investors, and, most importantly, Isabella's, the life insurance payout, the funds from their joint investment accounts. Everything was being funneled through a labyrinth of offshore entities into one final destination, a trust fund in Belize. A trust that listed only one beneficiary, Julian Croft. But there's more, Clara said, her voice dropping even lower. She pulled a small digital audio recorder from her purse. He was careless. He made a call to his partner in Belize from his office speakerphone last week. I recorded it. She pressed play. Julian's voice filled the room, slick with arrogant amusement. The greedy fool actually thinks she's coming with me. He laughed. She'll be waiting at the private airfield while I'm already on a beach in Tulum, drinking to her spectacular stupidity. She served her purpose. The insurance money is clean now, and I have a new life to start. The recording ended, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. He's leaving, Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. His flight is for next Tuesday, a one-way ticket to Belize City. He told everyone he was going for a week of meetings to finalize the resort deal. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and pity. He's not taking her with him. Mrs. Reynolds, he's taking everything she has, and he's going to disappear. The final, brutal truth of it settled over me, cold and heavy as a tombstone. Isabella, the master manipulator, the cold, calculating predator, was nothing more than a pawn in a much larger, more vicious game. Her desperate offer to give me Noah wasn't just about escaping the custody battle. It was about liquidating her last remaining burden so she could run away with a man who had already thrown her away. The great unraveling was complete. It was not a victory I could savor, but a profound human tragedy I had been forced to witness. My son had seen the rot in his own marriage, but even he could never have imagined the sheer depth of the deception that lay beneath it all. The final hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, the same day as Julian's planned flight. The air in the courtroom was thick with a tension that was almost palpable. This time, there was no performance from Isabella. She sat beside her lawyer, a shrunken, hollowed out version of her former self. The designer clothes hung on her frame, and the sunglasses could not hide the stark terror in her eyes. Julian was nowhere to be seen. Arthur had made a strategic decision. He would not reveal what we knew about Julian's betrayal immediately. First, he would dismantle Isabella's case, piece by piece, leaving her with absolutely nothing to stand on. He began with a report from Dr. Sharma, which was clinical and devastating. It detailed a pattern of narcissistic parenting, emotional neglect, and a clear prioritization of her own needs above her child's. It concluded that placing Noah in her primary care would be detrimental to his psychological development. Then, Arthur addressed the court. "Your Honor," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "We have one final piece of evidence. He played Noah's recording. The sound of Isabella's voice, cold and sharp as she called her own son a burden, filled the silent courtroom. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated truth. I watched Isabella's face crumble, the last vestiges of her composure dissolving into raw, ugly despair. She began to weep. Not the delicate, performative tears of before, but harsh, ragged sobs of a person who has lost everything. It was then that Arthur played his final card. "Your Honor," he said, turning his attention to the empty space in the gallery where Julian had once sat. "We have reason to believe that Mrs. Reynolds is not only a victim of her own poor choices, but also the victim of a significant and predatory financial fraud, perpetrated by her partner, Mr. Julian Croft." He presented the evidence Clara had brought us, the wire transfers, the shell corporations, the meticulously documented theft of Isabella's inheritance. And then he played the second recording, the sound of Julian's voice, laughing as he called Isabella a greedy fool and detailed his plan to abandon her, echoed through the courtroom. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Isabella's sobs turned into a raw, animalistic scream of pure rage and betrayal. She lunged to her feet, her face contorted, screaming Julian's name, a torrent of curses and threats pouring from her lips. It was a complete and total disintegration, the house of cards collapsing in on itself in a storm of its own making. Her lawyer tried to restrain her, but she was beyond reason. A woman pushed past the breaking point, stripped bare of all her lie and manipulations in the most public way imaginable. Judge Carlton watched the spectacle for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a sharp rap of her gavel, she brought the chaos to an end. The ruling was swift and final. Full legal and physical custody of Noah was granted to me. A restraining order was issued against Isabella. And, at Arthur's request, the judge ordered a federal marshal to be dispatched to the airport to detain Julian Croft for questioning before his flight could depart. As her lawyer led a now catatonic Isabella from the courtroom, she paused as she passed my aisle. She turned, her face a ravaged mask of hatred and despair. The silence in the hallway was absolute. She looked not at me, but through me. Her voice a dead, hollow whisper that was more chilling than any scream. "You know," she said, "in the end, he wasn't worth all this trouble." And then she was gone, a ghost swept away by the consequences of her own creation. The he she spoke of was my grandson, her son. Her final words were not an apology, not a plea, but a final, damning confession of a heart that had never been capable of love. Walking out of the courthouse and into the clean, crisp Oregon air felt like surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for months had finally lifted. There was no sense of triumph, no thrill of victory. There was only a profound, quiet relief. tinged with the sorrow of her final, cold admission. The war was over. Noah was safe. That evening, I sat with him in the living room, the house quiet around us. I explained to him, in the simple and honest terms a child could understand, that he would be living with me now, that his mother was going through a very difficult time and needed to be on her own for a while. He listened, his small face serious, and then he asked the one question that mattered. "Does that mean I don't have to go to Belize?" he whispered. "No, sweetheart," I said, pulling him into a hug. "You're home. You're staying right here." He buried his face in my shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, I felt his small body relax completely, the tension finally leaving him. Years passed, the sharp edges of grief softened, replaced by the warm, gentle patina of memory. Our house, once a fortress, became a home again, filled not with silence and strategy, but with the sounds of a boy growing up. The chaotic clutter of school projects, the scent of baking cookies on a Saturday afternoon, the sound of laughter echoing in the halls. Noah thrived. He grew tall and strong, his father's kindness shining in his eyes, his own quick wit and steady confidence, a testament to the healing power of stability and unconditional love. He joined the school's robotics club, his intricate designs and focused problem solving a beautiful echo of Leo's methodical mind. We never heard from Isabella directly again. Arthur informed me that she had left town the day after the hearing, disappearing into a new life of anonymity. Julian Croft was arrested at the airport, and the subsequent investigation unraveled a vast web of fraud that led to a lengthy prison sentence. Their story became a distant, cautionary tale, a storm that had passed, leaving behind a cleared sky. My victory was not in their downfall, but in the quiet, ordinary moments that followed. It was in watching Noah score his first soccer goal, in helping him with his lines for the school play, in sitting with him in the backyard on a clear summer night, pointing out the constellations just as his father and I had done so many years ago. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon when Noah was 16, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from somewhere in Europe, the handwriting elegant and unfamiliar. My heart seized for a moment before I saw the name on the return address, Isabella. I held it for a long time, the thin paper feeling heavy with the weight of the past. I considered throwing it away, protecting the peace we had fought so hard to build. But Noah was no longer a child. He deserved to know. I gave it to him that evening, explaining simply who it was from. He took it, his expression unreadable, and went to his room. An hour later, he came back downstairs and placed it on the table in front of me. It was not a letter of apology. It was not a plea for forgiveness or a mother's heartfelt inquiry after her long-lost son. It was a cold, legalistic document, drafted by an attorney. It was a formal request for Noah to legally relinquish any and all future claims to her, as she was preparing to marry into a prominent European family and wished to simplify her familial obligations. It was a final, transactional severing of a tie that had, in truth, been cut years ago at the bottom, in a small, cramped hand. She had added a single sentence, "I'm sure you understand that this is for the best, as my life now is very complicated." I watched Noah's face, searching for any sign of the old pain, the old wound. He read the note, then looked up at me, and what I saw in his eyes was not anger, not sadness, but a calm, quiet pity. "She's still running, isn't she?" "Grandma," he said, his voice steady. He picked up a pen from the desk, signed the document without hesitation, and pushed it back toward me. "Can we send it back tomorrow? I have a robotics competition to prepare for." And that was it. The ghost of his mother, the long shadow she had cast over his childhood, had finally, completely, vanished. It had no power here. Later that week, we were looking through an old photo album. He paused on a picture of a much younger Leo, smiling, holding him as a toddler on his shoulders. "Dad knew, didn't he?" Noah asked. his voice quiet. He knew Mom wasn't right. I looked at my grandson, now nearly a man, and I gave him the truth he deserved. Your father knew that love is supposed to be a safe place, I said. And when he realized it wasn't, he did everything in his power to build a new one for you. This house, this life, this was his final gift to you. He nodded, a quiet understanding passing between us. My promise to my son had been fulfilled. I had not won a war through revenge, but had honored his memory by cultivating the peace he had so desperately wanted for his child. In the end, from the ashes of a great tragedy, love had built a new beginning.